This is the Avenger Air Defense Weapon System. It fires the Stinger missile out of pods. It has a crew of 2. This is the gunner's console. This is where the majority of the engagements take place. It is equipped with a laser rangefinder and a forward-looking infrared. This is the gunner's optical sight. If it flies, it dies.
For all the trouble it took to get off the ground, the airplane was a simple thing. A couple of wings and an engine that couldn't power a leaf blower. When airplanes were first introduced, the military had no idea what to do with them. So they sent up planes to look down on battles, and the pilots decided among themselves that they could be more than mere observers. They decided to throw things down at the enemy. Pity the poor soldier in World War I. He lived in a ditch within meters of the enemy, who lived in a ditch of his own. All of a sudden, he had to contend with grenades and gunfire from above, dispensed by jaunty, white-scarfed pilots who seemed to see harassing infantry almost as sport. If a plane flew low enough and enough foot soldiers fired their rifles in the air, maybe, just maybe, a bullet would pierce one of the aircraft's vital systems, or even the pilot. Pilots called those few lucky bullets golden BBs, but didn't lose much sleep over them. Virtually invulnerable, the aviators flew happily over their wretched targets. Ever since then, the infantry has been plotting revenge. By World War II, sophisticated German and Japanese warbirds became among the infantry's most hated foes. The airborne enemy flew higher, faster, and delivered bigger bombs. Once again, Allied soldiers shook their fists at the bandits and cursed their own vulnerability. Once again, they turned their guns to the heavens. The skies soon filled with deadly rounds of anti-aircraft artillery, which pilots dubbed flak. Anti-aircraft artillery wiped its fair share of aircraft out of the sky, but the ground soldiers were still no match for their airborne oppressors. Military strategists plotted, planned, and prayed. Little did they know that the technology that would make the infantry's revenge a reality already existed, albeit in its infant stages. Visionaries like the American Robert Goddard were pioneering the development of rockets and liquid fuel propulsion systems. And the Germans, led by Wernher von Braun, and always one giant step ahead of the American rocketeers, were already experimenting with guidance systems. Hitler imagined that the V-2 would win the war for him. A rocket that, once fired, would guide itself to a target. He called it a vengeance weapon and used it to terrorize the civilian population of London. The U.S. considered the Nazi accomplishment so important that after the war, it transported the German rocket program intact to New Mexico. The race was on to bring rockets into every aspect of battle. Shooting at the ground, of course, was easy. But an airplane? That was going to be a challenge. The first anti-aircraft success showed just exactly how devastating missiles would become. In 1960, the U.S. Army fielded its first guided surface-to-air missile, the Hawk, homing all-the-way killer. With a range of 25 miles, the Hawk defended against low to medium altitude aircraft. Just over 6.5 feet long and measuring a little over a foot in diameter, the Hawk was the most advanced surface-to-air missile in the world. Its radar could find incoming aircraft, and the missile homed in on that reflected radar energy. The Hawk was an enormous success. Upgrades have kept it in service for more than 30 years. But the Hawk was not what the World War I infantryman had in mind when he first waved his fist at a passing plane. The Hawk couldn't be tucked into a pack, and it wasn't a system the foot soldier himself could use. That was what the infantry wanted, and during the 1950s, both Americans and Soviets started to research shoulder-fired anti-aircraft weapons. But transferring this idea from the drawing board to the battlefield was a colossal task. It took years to develop rocket motors powerful enough to chase down a supersonic fighter, yet small enough for a man to carry. It took even longer to develop the tiny guidance system that could steer the missile to its target. The Soviets introduced the first man-portable surface-to-air missile in 1966. They called it Strela, which is Russian for arrow. 2 years later, the U.S. Army deployed the General Dynamics Red Eye. It was 4 feet long and nearly 3 inches in diameter. The launcher and missile combined weighed less than 30 pounds and could easily be managed by one man. It was the infantryman's dream, except for one small thing.
The big deficiency on the Red Eye was that you couldn't attack an aircraft coming at you. You could only attack him when he was going away, which, as you can imagine, might not be too swift if he happened to be firing at you or dropping ammunition on you.
The Red Eye and its Soviet counterpart were what the military calls tail chasers. The missile homes in on infrared energy, heat, specifically the hot metal of the aircraft's engine exhaust. For the missile to see the target, the aircraft had to be heading away from the shooter, which meant that first the shooter had to weather the aircraft's attack. If he survived that, he could get a shot off. These infantry anti-aircraft weapons did manage to shoot down some aircraft. Pilots now had to reckon with a new and unlikely enemy, a grunt on the ground. It is the nature of rapidly advancing technology that by the time a new piece of military hardware is deployed, it's well on its way to being obsolete. By 1967, only a few years after the introduction of the Red Eye, Hughes Missile Systems was already planning its replacement. The development process was long and troubled, but in 1981, Hughes handed the Army a remarkable new missile, the Stinger.
It's a gift not only to the infantry, but to anybody on the battlefield. Excellent air defense weapon.
It had better eyes than the Red Eye. The missile's seeker head was cooled before launch, which made it more sensitive to infrared radiation. It could detect not just the plane's hot tailpipe, but also merely warm sections of the aircraft, the leading edges of the wings, the glint of the sun off a canopy.
The big advantage of that is it takes heat off the skin of the aircraft and the front of the wings. You can acquire him as he's coming towards you. Hopefully shoot him down before he gets to your location, or if not, at least shortly after.
The Stinger was also smarter than the Red Eye. It used a combination of optical filters and computer power to distinguish between real targets and decoy flares. A complete Stinger launch system weighs about 34 pounds. It includes a missile and a disposable launch tube that snaps onto a reusable gripstock. The gripstock is the brain of the Stinger. It includes the aiming sight and launch electronics, along with a socket attachment to an expendable battery and coolant unit. The gripstock also includes an identification friend or foe interrogator. This is basically a radio transmitter that sends out a series of coded digital pulses. If the target has a friendly IFF transponder and it sends back the proper coded reply, the gunner knows the target is friendly. To use the Stinger, the gunner begins by removing the protective lens cap over the muzzle of the launch tube and inserting a fresh battery coolant unit into the gripstock. This powers up the missile electronics and cools the seeker head. He tracks the target through the telescopic sight. When the missile locks onto the target, he hears a high-pitched steady tone from a built-in speaker, and an indicator light appears in the sight. All that is left is to pull the trigger. The missile accelerates rapidly, reaching more than twice the speed of sound. Its ability to follow even a fast-moving target is uncanny.
When the flight motor actually kicks in, it's just like a big boom, bump. You're like, whoa. It's an adrenaline rush. I actually fired a missile. It's an experience. Once you see it destroy the target, it's like, wow, I actually did that. Imagine if that did that to a real plane. The first time was the best because you didn't even realize you just pulled the trigger.
The Stinger is a fire-and-forget weapon. Once the operator pulls the trigger, he has no further responsibilities. The missile finds its own way to the target. The operator can seek cover, load another round, or just stand and admire his handiwork. Official reports register the Stinger's maximum range at 3 miles. That's more than a mile farther than the red-eye. However, some unofficial reports had the Stinger effective at as much as 11 miles, depending on the speed and altitude of the target. Few weapons systems can be said to have single-handedly won a war, but the Stinger did. After the Russians invaded Afghanistan in 1979, several hundred Stingers worked their way from American factories to the Khyber Pass, the smuggler's haven between the Indian subcontinent and the Middle East. How they got there has never been officially acknowledged. But using Stingers, the Mujahideen guerrillas downed more than 270 Soviet aircraft. Stingers scored an astonishing 79% success rate. Soviet infantry, cold and far from home, had to get by without air cover. By 1989, the Soviets pulled out, their empire on the verge of collapse. Although Stinger was developed primarily for the Army, the U.S. military has put them to use in all of the services except the Coast Guard. Stinger was also drafted for the air-to-air role on Army attack helicopters and other aircraft. But the primary mission for the Stinger remained in the air defense role for ground troops.
Oh, there he is right there.
The Army continued to seek out ways to improve on the system to make it more versatile and more effective. The four-wheeled solution was right under their nose. As effective as the Stinger was, it still had limitations.
When the Stinger was shoulder-mounted, it could only move as fast as the person on the ground carrying it, and it had a Humvee that carried the Stingers, but they had to stop and get out before they could actually fire.
The key to mobility in the Army is the Humvee, a steroid-mutated descendant of the Jeep. Almost as soon as the Army deployed Stinger missiles, the courtship between the Stinger and the Hummers began. Arranging the marriage fell to Boeing Aerospace in 1987. Boeing mounted a pedestal on top of a Humvee, attached a missile pod to each side and loaded each pod with 4 stingers. They built a control center between the missile pods and called their creation the Avenger.
The Avenger itself can fire on the move, so you have better coverage for, say, convoys. You can integrate into a convoy of like transport vehicles or whatever, and you can roll with them, and you can be right with them and provide air defense while you're rolling.
The Avenger requires a 2-man team, a gunner and the team chief who doubles as the driver. In a high alert status, the gunner actually rides in the turret, scanning the skies for contacts.
You have all-weather capability. You can fire at night, in the rain, in the fog, in the snow.
The Avenger's main limitation is that it's a thin-skinned vehicle. It's vulnerable to small arms and light artillery, the kinds of fire that a tank, for example, would barely even notice. So on the battlefield, Avengers have a tendency to go their own way. They isolate themselves from the ground fighting, hiding on hillsides and scanning assigned areas of the sky for unfriendly aircraft.
You're looking for a tactical position, a position where you can get into and it's hard for other people to get into, a position where you have good fields of fire, where you can see all the way down your primary target line. The primary target line is an expected avenue of approach for enemy aircraft. You want to be able to provide self-defense for yourself against ground troops.
A team under fire can, in fact, abandon their vehicle entirely. In only a few seconds, without even blinking a defensive eye, they can switch to remote control.
I tell the gunner in place, prepare for action.
The team chief carries the RCU from the cab out 50 meters. We have a pointer assembly that attaches to the top of the RCU, and the team chief, he spots the target and moves the pointer assembly so it's pointing at the target.
That picture's good. You want 1,000 meter reference? 1,000 meter reference.
What I do is hold the hand station and push a button, pretty much, and it slews right to where the pointer assembly is pointing. As soon as he's ready down here,
Mow down okay on, drive lock safe. Come on down.
I come down. Combo check.
Good combo check.
Driver lock 2, enable weapons on safe, tracking on auto, helicopter off, on cage auto.
Give him the north reference and everything, and he puts the north reference on computer.
Nice and soft, easy.
Then basically we're 50 meters away from the truck, so if we do actually get bombed by some artillery or something, we might have a chance.
Turn the PTO, search the scan.
Viper 1-0, this is Viper 1-6, in place, prepare for action, over.
It's not really comforting, but, you know, it comes with the job. You got to do what you got to do. Mission first.
At the heart of the Avenger system is, of course, the Stinger, the same 34-pound missile that went into Afghanistan on horseback. That gives the Avenger the ability to virtually disappear. The crews are trained to switch to hand-carried launch in a minimal amount of time. They melt into the woods along with the infantry. It's no surprise that applications of the Stinger are showing up on more and more drawing boards these days. The new Apache variant, the Longbow, will carry Stingers, giving the helicopter a viable air-to-air killing capacity. It is not inconceivable that American attack helicopters will one day dogfight with supersonic jets and win. The Army is also attaching Stingers to Bradley fighting vehicles. The so-called linebacker system will stretch anti-aircraft protection right to the front lines.
As far as shooting down the targets, you know, anybody can get up there and get on the target, get tone on the target and pull the trigger. You know, I could train you to do it. I could probably train anybody here to do it.
The Stinger has never been used, at least officially, by Americans in combat. The Army was primed to use the Stinger and the Avenger systems during the Gulf War, but never got the chance. Anticipated low-level enemy aircraft attacks never materialized because Allied aircraft destroyed most of the Iraqi Air Force on the ground. But its effectiveness has been repeatedly demonstrated. Ground soldiers will continue to wait patiently for their chance to test the system in combat. They train, knowing that they have what their great-grandfathers had wished for, a magic weapon to sweep the skies clear of enemy aircraft. Magic? Maybe. Deadly? Definitely. With Stinger, the foot soldier has finally evened the odds.